So, Sean, buried in amongst many other things is this report from the OBR that drifted out at the beginning of the week. And that's the Office of Budget Responsibility. And really, the report is very much in line with the OBR's name. And this particular forecast takes a very forward look over the long-term finances of the country. Now, just a reminder to listeners and viewers that the OBR are apolitical. They're a group of analysts and deliberately stand outside of the Treasury. And they're normally famous for providing independent view of the Chancellor's budget proposals, but they do other work.
Wasn't it set up by George Osborne, if I
think
remember
it
rightly?
was. Yeah, I think it was.
It's not that long-lived, if you like. It's not been
it isn't.
30, 40 years.
And they're much maligned, and I think the general feeling by all chancellors think they're too pessimistic because they have this habit of looking at what the chancellor proposes and says, no, that won't make any difference. No, that won't make any difference. So you can imagine how frustrating that must be. But this report was nothing to do with an individual chancellor's budget. And it actually looked out to 2070, even saying it sounds weird because you and I won't have to worry about it too much.
No.
But it reminded me, and I've spoken about this on the pod before and been called communist. It reminded me of...
Who would call you communist?
Well, indeed, Sean, who would? But I do rather like the fact that when I read an article years ago that the Chinese take a 1,000-year view in their planning cycle. And I rather like that. Now, you can obviously only do that in a one-party state because no one's trying to kick you out, like in our system. But anyway, they take this 50-year view, and there's some pretty, trying to be cheerful, but it's difficult, some pretty shocking stuff coming out of this. And I've with the help of ChatGPT, other brands available, I've filleted what was a 180-page report to 5 things that I thought were significant. And in the time allowed, I'll see how many I get to. But perhaps the biggest headline that came out of the report is this notion that public debt, public borrowing is on an unsustainable path. It can't carry on. This isn't a Labour view. It's not a Tory view. It's not a Reform view. It's their independent view. And the UK debt is projected to rise sharply over the coming decades, potentially reaching 300% of GDP by 2070s. That's unless policy changes are made. Now, people listening say, well, what's that mean? Well, to put it in perspective, today our public sector borrowing is 95% of GDP, and the amount is £3 trillion. And just a reminder what GDP is, that's your gross output as a country in a given year. So clearly, it's a bit, if you think about your own income, it's not great to be borrowing 3 times the nation's income, which is the path we're on. And it's unsustainable. Why? We have an aging population, as we all know. That's driving up higher costs. That isn't a UK-specific issue. That's across certainly the Western world. And allied to that, the birth rate is falling. Well, actually, why is that happening? People are living longer and not so many kids are being born. And as a result of that, you see a massive increase in demand on healthcare, social care, and the state pension. Again, unsustainable. The OBR are saying their third point is that early action is far cheaper than delaying. So it would require much smaller tax rises if that's the way we decide to go, or much smaller spending cuts if we deal with the problem now. Hang on to that thought with Mr. Burnham about to arrive. Again, you and I could have wrote this. Economic growth is critical. Well, of course it is. Faster productivity growth would boost tax revenues, improve the fiscal outlook, but it cannot be relied upon alone to solve the problem because the pressures on borrowing are too great and the economy really can't grow that quick. And the final point, governments face difficult choices. So, the answer may be a bit of everything, but the problem you get with our leaders is because they're worried about 3 years' time, not 50 years' time. Well, 5 years at the beginning of the term, 3 years now in the case of Mr. Burnham. yeah, it's difficult to see how anyone would grasp this nettle and say, we have a problem, we need to deal with it. So there's loads of other facts and figures, which I won't drain the podcast on here. But basically, Houston, we have a problem, and what are we going to do about it? So have you heard about this already? Do you think we can just sort of not worry about it? Just look at...
I hadn't until you mentioned it, but the two things spring to mind, really.
Yeah.
One is the old adage that was always used in economics when I did my education in economics, all things being equal, which all things are not always equal. And the other famous quote from Harold Macmillan that events steer by events. I mean, the idea that you can project 50 years down the road when they don't even know what's going to happen next year, I think is for the birds. Whilst I appreciate what you say, things need to be done now to tackle problems that are coming short term, not 50 years away. But I do think it's a bit daft to be suggesting that, 50 years, that we need to make provision for what might happen 50 years down the road. I think we need to look much closer in terms of our time span. I mean, just to take one issue, for example, they're talking about a shrinking demographic in terms of the number of people who are of working age. Now, we've brought that upon ourselves, haven't we, at the end of the day, over the last few years, because we'd taken a lot of immigration from Eastern Europe before we foolishly, in some people's eyes and in my eyes, voted to leave the European Union. And we're now cutting down on the number of immigrants that we've got coming into this country because of pressures from the right. So we're down from about 1 million, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, down to 177,000 now net immigration into this country. Unless we're going to have, and this is, I guess, what you're talking about, unless we're going to have a big campaign to encourage people to have larger families in this country, then we need to increase our immigration. And we can do that quite easily, but the political climate won't allow us to do that at the moment. So I don't know how you deal with that. On the other side of the coin, there's new technology and AI coming in terms of treating people with health concerns and on that side of things. So hopefully that should allow us to stabilise the bill with regard to something like the National Health Service. On the other side of the coin, we've got to find more money for defence. These economic reports are interesting, aren't they? But I think what are their... You've put forward the negatives effectively. What have they come up with? Any solutions to these problems, or have they just...
Well, no, that's not their role. They're not policymakers. Otherwise, that would be, they would be accused of either being left, right, or in the middle. But their overarching message is that the short-term fiscal position is manageable. Okay, but long-term finances are not. And they see governments having to take a combination of policy interventions on potentially higher taxes, slower growth in public spending, reforms to pensions and healthcare, and policies that raise productivity of the labour force. And the problem with that little menu there is that they don't sit neatly with any one party, do they?
No.
So higher taxes might suit, say, the Labour Party, and it will do because we know that's coming. But slower growth in public spending would not. And you could flip that for the Tories. Reforms to pensions and healthcare, well, no one is allowed to touch the NHS, are they? They're just not allowed. And pensions, crikey. In an ageing population, you've got a huge electorate who are over the age of 65, 66, 67 as it is now. So, you've got real issues. And this is where the political system doesn't work because... Yeah, I actually disagree with not taking a long-term view because these aren't things that might happen. These are things that will happen. Yeah,
but you don't know what the outside consequences are going to be. That tomorrow we might have a resolution of what's happening in Ukraine. They might have an end to the Gulf War, and you might see a bounce in trade around the world and a reduction in energy supply, in which case that will put us in a much better position than we are at the moment.
It will help.
Nobody can... And you're at the moment, even what they're suggesting is you cutting this, you're not provide. That's a speculative as to whether you're going to provide more growth by doing that. No, you might just keep GDP exactly the same by you're moving it from one side of the equation to the other. So for example, you're raising taxes to pay for what are you? And then you're cutting public spending on the other side of the coin. Well,
I mean,
how is
there's
that?
no question that the easiest and most painless solution to a part of this problem, but it won't solve all of the problem, is to achieve meaningful economic growth. Right? There's no question about that. And that's one where everyone can go, oh, yes. But Mrs. Reeves has tried to do it, and
That's
it's
how we
difficult.
get there. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
difficult
absolutely.
because something, and then you've got the yin and the yang. So she may well want to grow the economy, but that's difficult when you load on extra taxes to businesses. So I'm less about sort of specific interventions. My point in raising this is that there is a risk that the country will be sleepwalking into a problem. And really the big message I took out of this is not there is one or two things you should do, but it's a suite of things. But the quicker you have the medicine, the less painful the intervention will be. And all countries face this. I'm not saying we're unique, and obviously
No.
countries will be to a greater or lesser degree. I read a presentation yesterday about public sector borrowing as a proportion of GDP, and we're on a similar percentage to the US, ironically. That's not great, by the way, because they have a big balance sheet. And it's just interesting to see lots of countries are worse than us, and lots are better. But all are having these issues. And you ask yourself, why is this particular to now? I think we have had this period where corporately balance sheets are doing well and stock values have grown steadily over the last few years, but countries can't seem to manage that trick. It's rather strange. I think the biggest issue is the aging population. Obviously, you can't stop people getting older and living longer.
No.
But you can certainly make it more attractive to have kids, I think.
You can encourage that. Yeah. I think there's things happening in the world that if you were looking at having children now, and you'd be having a close look as to. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? On the one hand, I'm not taking a political stance on that, but on the one hand, you've got an element of the public who would say that people need to be responsible and only have children that they feel that they can afford to finance, if you like. There was this huge argument 20, 30 years ago about women just, teenagers having kids just to get money from benefits and what have you. And now we're almost in the opposite position, that we want people to have children.
We do. Yeah.
But how do you do that responsibly so that they're not a burden on the state? It's almost like you're suggesting that if you're earning over a certain amount of money, you can have children, and we want you to have many more children. But if you're not earning, we really rather you didn't have children.
I think the majority of families are pretty good at figuring out if they can afford to have kids or not. The big hurdles are childcare, because that is so expensive, even if you can get a place, and just the general cost of raising them, So policy interventions around that could be helpful.
But that's the whole point. You're saying I'm pretty sure that most families they can't, because without policy interventions, most families wouldn't be able to afford to have
exactly.
kids.
That's what I'm saying.
And at the moment, we've got child tax credits. We've got child tax credits already, and we've got child benefit already, which are policy interventions. You're effectively arguing for more policy interventions, so an increased expenditure for people who have children. Is that right?
Obviously, if you think that a policy intervention is to increase the birth rate, you obviously have to do more. You can't just say, please all have more children. That's just one tiny area. But when I read this is when you need a strategy. But the problem with it, I think our politics won't deliver a solution to this.
No.
Because the two main parties, if we can still call them that, will only support half of the proposals. So, and a few of these, reducing the state pension or getting rid of the triple lock can only lose votes. They can't increase votes. Maybe
no. Politically, it's difficult, isn't it? But then I'm, as you know, we've had this conversation on the pod before. I'm not necessarily in favour of the way that he looks as though he's going to take power. But if you look at Burnham's policy agenda, there are elements of that in it. He's talking about encouraging families to have. He's talking about cutting the welfare bill on one side. Whether he's going to be able to get that through his own backbenchers is quite another issue, but he is talking about that, and he's talking about more investment in industry.
Right.
So I think he's got quite an interesting at the moment.
But
whether they'll come to fruition when he actually gets
these
into the
can't
House
just be slogans, and that's the problem, because he hasn't laid anything out in any
he
document.
can't done it already, can
And
he? He's not in the House yet.
No, he's only had a few years to think about this. The the fact that he won't even take questions from reporters. Where do you go?
I think this is a bit rich. You've got to give him a chance to get his feet under the table. He's not even got the role yet. So
he's already in the armchair, Sean. We all know that.
Yeah. I don't think. I don't think. That's
anyway, look, I started this as an apolitical piece, but you've dragged us back into the political gutter.
Well, no, I haven't.
The bigger picture. I'm conscious of time, but the bigger picture is whether you believe we should be looking 10, 20, 30, 50 years. The earlier we grasp the nettle, the less problems we're causing for the generations of the future.
I come back to what I said earlier. It's absolutely pointless looking 50 years ahead, because nobody knows what's going to happen next week. A 10-year policy agenda I can see is sensible. And I think most political parties would look over a 2-term policy agenda. Looking 50 years, I think, is absolutely pointless.
Well, I'll say that, we need to put an end to short-termism, but look, at least you've moved out to 10 years, which is progress. And on that, I'll leave it there. And thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Mystic Meg.